With one word salad speech, Nikki Haley managed to destroy the entire righteous cause myth. Welcome back to the channel, Culture Confederacy here. It is Friday. So Nikki Haley, she had this, by the way, thank you for subscribing, being a part of this thing we call the Culture Confederacy. And no, this is not a channel about white supremacy, in case you're wondering. It's about history and cultural preservation, not taking down everything you disagree with, being able to have an open debate about topics such as the Civil War, freedom of expression. So she had this Q&A, and now she's claiming this person who asked the question that he's a Democrat plant. That's what she's claiming right now. He's a Democrat plant because she backtracked on Thursday during this local radio interview. So he asked her, what do you think is the cause of the Civil War? Typical Republican word salad response here. Quote, I think the cause of the war was basically how government was going to run, the freedom and what people could and couldn't do. I think it always comes down to the role of government, what the rights of the people are. I will always stand by the fact that I think government was intended to secure the rights and freedoms of the people. It was never meant to be all things to all people. Huh? Let me read this again. I will always stand by the fact that I think government was intended to secure the rights and freedoms of the people. It was never meant to be all things to all people. So then she backtracks because social media exploded. The runaway media exploded. They're accusing her of being racist. All you MAGA supporters, you're now racist. You support slavery, plantation life. And she said, well, of course it was about slavery. I know that. I'm from the South. That's the easy part. Well, actually, she was born in 1972. Her parents are from India. Whereas I have family going back to the 1700s in Kentucky. So, Nikki Haley. But we need to ask the question, why was the Civil War fought? Was it really about slavery? And if it was about slavery, somebody else here on YouTube asked this question, why slavery? So what I want to do is go through some of these secession documents with you so you can see that it wasn't just about quote-unquote slavery. And when they talked about slavery, it wasn't quote-unquote slavery. It's the fact that the Union, the North, the federal government, was preventing these southern states from having access to the Western territories. And the Supreme Court had ruled that this is common territory. It's open to all citizens, whether you're a slave owner or not. All American citizens at the time had access to the territories. That's really what the fight was about. Lincoln promised that he would not mess with slavery where it existed in the South. He just didn't want it in the West. And the reason for that wasn't because of some moral crusade. It's because they didn't want, it's all about power. I've been talking with people online about this. I said, like all conflicts, it comes down to two things: political power and the right of people to govern themselves. Someone said, the right for people to govern themselves, well, they own slaves. Isn't that kind of contradictory? Well, you got to look at things in the time in which this happened. We're talking the mid-19th century, where you didn't have automobiles or smartphones or anything like that. And you needed a workforce. People didn't punch a clock somewhere and work 9 to 5. That's not how things worked back then. Could you imagine living back then with no internet? No, you SJW types would just rip your hair out. But so as I said, this has caused a big to-do on social media, on places like MSNBC. But let me give you a couple of stats. Before we get into these secession documents, let me give you a couple of stats. So according to the 1840 census, these are northern states now. Granted, the slave population is small, but according to the 1840 census, New Hampshire had 1 slave, Rhode Island 5, Illinois 331, Pennsylvania 64, but there were none in these states in 1850. However, this doesn't mean that you didn't have a slave presence in the North, because these northern states passed these gradual emancipation laws, which meant that it wasn't the living slave that was free. Usually it was their offspring after so many years of service. And by that time, these slaves, the time that these emancipation laws were passed, they were probably entering into some type of indentured servitude, some type of apprenticeship that would last so many years. And a lot of times that didn't get counted on the census. As you know, the census is every 10 years. So that's just some stats for you. Now, when it came to the 3/5 compromise, because I've seen this online as well. Well, those Southerners were so racist, they only wanted to count people as 3/5 of the person. Well, that's not the whole story, because you see, the South actually wanted all these slaves to be counted 100% in the House of Representatives. That's what they wanted. But the North said, no, we're not going to do that. In fact, we don't want any slaves to be counted in the South. Because, again, it was all about political power, representation. So they came up with this thing called the 3/5 compromise. Originally, the South wanted 60% of the Electoral College vote. But even though some of these northern states opposed slavery, not all people in the North were opposed. Not all people in the North, rather, were for abolition, because the white working class in the North feared that these freed blacks would move north and they would take their jobs. So why didn't the North secede? I mean, William Lloyd Garrison called for the North to secede, right? So that's just a little background here. Some stats for you, what was really going on at that time. And now you really get into the meat of the matter here. This is where the rubber meets the road. So I'm going to start with, this is Georgia's secession document. Yes, all these documents talk about slavery. Everybody knows that. But this is what it says in Georgia's secession document, just to prove that there was more than just slavery happening at the time here. In the first years of the Republic, the navigating, commercial, and manufacturing interests of the North began to seek profit and aggrandizement at the expense of the agriculture interest. Even the owners of fishing smacks sought and obtained bounties for pursuing their own businesses, which yet continue, and $500,000 is now paid to them annually out of the Treasury. In today's money, that's roughly about $10 million. The navigating interest begged for protection against foreign shipbuilders and against competition in the coasting trade. Congress granted both requests, and by prohibitory acts gave an absolute monopoly of this business to each of their interests. Not content with these great and unjust advantages, so the North and all these manufacturers in the North, industrialization, or these industries, these factories, they're all getting these benefits from the North. Kind of sounds like what we're going through today with all these, deals in Congress. That train that goes to nowhere in California. But not content with these great and unjust advantages, they have sought to throw the legitimate burden of their business as much as possible upon the public. So throwing the cost of lighthouses, buoys, and the maintenance of their seamen upon the Treasury, government was paying $2 million at the time. That's roughly about $39 million in today's money. So that's what was happening with the Treasury. This money was coming out of the Treasury for these corrupt public works projects via the back door. Then they go on to talk about how plantation owners who had a legal right to travel wherever they wanted to, a lot of times were getting arrested with their slaves. And they mention here that slaves who voluntarily came with their plantation owners on these trips to the North or wherever were also caught up in this, where they're either being detained, the plantation owner is being arrested and charged with these crimes without a fair trial. So that was an issue. So let's go to South Carolina's secession document. Now, yes, this talks about slavery here, but it's not, once again, quote-unquote, slavery. The state of New Jersey, at an early day, passed a law in conformity with her constitutional obligation, but the current of anti-slavery feeling has led more recently to enact laws which render inoperative the remedies provided by our own law and by the laws of Congress. In the state of New York, even the right of transit for a slave has been denied by our tribunals. They're referring to the case of Lemon versus New York. I talked about that before. And the states of Ohio and Iowa refused to surrender to justice fugitives charged with murder, not, runaway slaves here. We're talking about fugitives charged with murder and with inciting servile insurrection in the state of Virginia. So you have these extremist abolitionist groups. It's kind of like, best way to describe it, it's kind of like this Jews for Peace. They're having all these protests and they're, going into these buildings and having these sit downs. It's kind of that sort of thing here. People standing on highways, stopping traffic, standing on a bridge somewhere. Well, they were kind of doing the same thing in the North, but a little more violently. And of course, we've seen that with the 2020 riots, when Trump got elected in 2016. And no, I did not vote for Trump. So the same type of thing. It's never changed because politics is dirty. It can be violent. Our founders knew that. That's why they set up the system the way that it is. So we have this idea of checks and balances so that we don't have mob rule here. So their big beef was you're not returning these fugitives who are committing all these violent crimes against people in the South, a lot of times innocent people in the South. People were trying to incite insurrection. You thought January 6th was bad. Go back and look at what was happening in the South in 1861, 1862, or just before the Civil War here. Now they finally go on to say here that on the 4th day of March next, would have been 1861, this party will take possession of the government. It has announced that the South shall be excluded from the common territory. The judicial tribunal shall be made sectional, and that a war must be waged against slavery until it shall cease throughout the United States. So this war on slavery was being hostile to the South, not giving them a fair shake, as was guaranteed by the Constitution as it was written at the time in the 1860s or 1850s, 1860s. And they thought that this was violating their rights as Southerners because all states in this thing called the United States were supposed to be treated equal under the Constitution. So finally, I'm going to go to Texas's secession document here. The federal government, while but partially under the control of these, are unnatural and sectional enemies, has for years almost entirely failed to protect the lives and property of the people of Texas against the Indian savages on our border, talking about these violent Native American tribes, which we had at the time, and more recently against the murderous forays of banditti from the neighboring territory of Mexico. And when our state governments had expanded large amounts for such purpose, the federal government had refused to reimburse us, thus rendering our condition more insecure and harassing than it was during the existence of the Republic of Texas. So they have all these attacks happening from groups like the banditti. You have these violent tribes. We know of these tribal wars that were still going on in the 1850s, 1860s in the Western territories. Well, innocent people were being caught in that, especially in places like Texas. And the federal government was turning a blind eye to it. And Texas said, hey, we need your help here. Government wouldn't do a damn thing about it. So again, it wasn't necessarily quote-unquote slavery. And as you can see here, there were far more issues happening than just slavery. Now, you can argue it was a factor in the Civil War, but to say that the Civil War was solely fought over slavery, as I'm showing here, isn't historically accurate. So they list, it's almost like the Declaration of Independence, listing all these abuses or all these offenses. They have for years past encouraged and sustained lawless organizations to steal our slaves and prevent their recapture, which at the time, fugitive slave clause was in the Constitution, and have repeatedly murdered Southern citizens while lawfully seeking their rendition. They have invaded Southern soil and murdered unoffending citizens, and through the press, their leading men and the fanatical pulpit have bestowed praise upon the actors and assassins in these crimes, while the governors of several of their states have refused to deliver parties implicated and indicted for participation in such offenses, not returning these violent criminals, which is also in the Constitution. If you commit a crime in one state, you flee to another, that state has a right to retrieve the person who committed that crime. Kind of why we have the FBI. although I have my issues with the FBI. So I thought I'd share this with you today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Nikki Haley comes out in one word salad speech, destroys this whole narrative of the righteous cause myth. And as you can see here, there was far more going on than slavery. Yes, it was being debated. Yes, we see it in all the secession documents. But now you know the main cause was denying access to these territories and the federal government turning a blind eye to all these violent acts that were committing, that these violent abolitionist groups or whoever were committing against innocent citizens in the South or wherever in part of the territories, taking money out of the treasury for these corrupt backdoor projects, gives you a totally different picture of what was happening in 1860, 1861. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, you know what to do. You can also follow me at Instagram, #JasonComposes, because I write music in my spare time. Or you can find me at X, Culture Confederacy, at Culture Confed 1 on X. This is the Culture Confederacy saying peace out. Stay safe, everybody. God bless this thing called the United States. And you know how we do it here. This is where the past crashes with the present. I'll catch you next time. And y'all have a great Friday afternoon.